Welcome back, everyone. In Module 3, we're going to be having a look at virtual machines. Let's dive right in. The basics of virtual machines and the creation of virtual machines is very, very simple. If you've ever spec'd out a computer of your own, gone to a website and bought a motherboard and added a CPU and memory and added a disk controller, usually built into the motherboards now, but certainly added some piece of storage. Maybe it's an SSD or an NVMe device. You'll know what it means to create a computer. And if you know what it means to create a computer, you know what it means to create a virtual machine as well. The process is very, very similar, if not completely identical, other than the fact that you're not actually buying anything and dropping anything in the data center. You're actually just pushing a button that says, hey, let's create a new virtual machine. So let's look at how this is actually done and what some of the considerations are as we are choosing the components that will go into our virtual machine. We're dividing this module up into 3 different lessons. The first one will just go through the mechanics, the pushing of the buttons and the twisting of the knobs and all that kind of stuff for how we create virtual machines from scratch. In lesson number 2, we're going to look at a hardware deep dive. That is, what are the decisions that I need to make around things like how many virtual CPUs, how much memory, and how do I do all of that? And what about network cards and storage controllers? And what about virtual disks and how are those virtual disks provisioned and all of those sorts of things? And in lesson number 3, we'll have a little bit of a discussion about containers, and hopefully we'll be able to relate that discussion to what a vSphere administrator needs to know about this new container environment that we so often now find ourselves working within. So with that in mind, let's have a look at virtual beans. Now, in our new environment that we're trying to build here, we've got a couple of different areas, right? We've got internally developed applications, we've got commercial applications, we've got Windows systems, we've got Linux systems. We want to virtualize everything because we know that virtual machines are better than physical machines. We've got some systems that are absolutely business critical that we need to maintain support for, if not at 100% uptime, then at a good serious, 4 nines, 5 nines type level of uptime, minimizing our unplanned downtimes. And we know that we've already talked about some of those systems that we have, like vSphere HA that we mentioned, and vSphere DRS, that we can use to implement some of these, or to satisfy, I should say, some of these requirements. Okay? So it also says here that in our organization, we've started to use containers as a way to build and publish applications. So we need to consider, how do containers fit within this virtualized environment where we've so often been focused on running applications within virtual machines outside of that sort of idea of packaging applications into containers. Okay? So let's make sure that we know how our virtual machines work. We know how to satisfy the application requirements with virtual machines. And let's also try to learn a little bit about containers. So when it comes to implementing containers, we can look at the different methods of doing so within our vSphere environment. So here in lesson 1, we're going to start with the basics. Let's have a look at creating virtual machines. We'll build brand new virtual machines. We'll provision those virtual machines with resources. We'll also look at ways that we can import virtual appliances in the form of OVF templates. We'll look at VMware tools and explain how important it is that VMware tools be installed in every single one of our virtual machines. And then we'll actually get into some labs creating virtual machines and installing VMware tools. Now, we can build virtual machines in a number of different ways. And the easiest way certainly is through our graphical clients. We know that we have already discussed at least two of those graphical clients in the vSphere client, which we know is driven through vCenter server, as well as our host client. Okay? We'd much rather use that vSphere client through vCenter server. That gives us the most options, certainly, about where our virtual machines are going to run, whether they run in clusters, whether they run on a particular ESXi host, and so on. Okay? Our ability to do things like vMotion relies on vCenter server as well. So we'll focus on that, but we also want to understand that if we had to, and we just had, say, for example, a single host in the environment, we can go to our vSphere host client and also create a virtual machine that way. Now, when we build our virtual machines, we can build them as brand new VMs, but we can also build new VMs from existing VMs, taking a virtual machine and cloning it, or deploying a new virtual machine from a template. We'll look at how we do that a little bit later. Okay? We can build virtual machines, we can build virtual appliances, we can build VApps, which are groups of virtual machines. We can then store those in an OVF template and hand those away and off to other people to then build virtual machines in the same sort of fashion. So let's look at a whole bunch of different ways that we can do this. In this case, we're building a brand new virtual machine using the vSphere client, using the new virtual machine wizard. This is really the easiest way for me to go through and build a virtual machine from scratch. So this is the first time you're going to see one of VMware's really nicely designed and easy to understand wizards that'll walk you through, in this case, an 8-step process, starting by selecting this virtual machine creation type. Oh, we'll create a new virtual machine. Notice some of the other options that we have here, deploying from templates and cloning existing virtual machines and so on. And then we'll select the name in the folder and a compute resource, that is, what ESXi host or cluster am I going to put it on. We'll select our storage, and we'll go through the rest of these options. In our vSphere client, all we have to do is right-click on an inventory object, like a host, that has the ability of running and storing virtual machines. It's just our way of getting started. So we right-click and select New Virtual Machine. In module number 4, we'll get a little deeper into the vSphere inventory there. In this case, we're showing you a similar wizard that's done from the host client. Not quite as many options here, but it's the same idea, right? We say we're going to build a brand new virtual machine in step 1, and in step number 2, we're going to give the virtual machine a name, and then we're going to select a few other things. We're going to select the hardware compatibility. That is, what version of ESXi do you want this virtual machine to be compatible with? Now, with each new version of ESXi, we have some new features in virtual machines, or for virtual machines. So if you need all the latest and greatest features, you need to select the latest version of ESXi. If you don't need the latest and greatest features, and you possibly might want your virtual machine to be able to run on older versions of ESXi, you can choose that there as well. Now, the most important thing about this is that you appropriately choose the guest OS family, that is Windows or Linux, most of the time, and the version of the guest OS that you're going to be installing. Once you've selected that, then you can go through and choose some of the hardware options for your virtual machine. How many vCPUs, how much memory do you want this virtual machine to have? How big should the hard disk be? How many hard disks should there be? What SCSI controller would you like to use? Now, having said that, on the previous screen, and I'm actually going to go back a screen, we see that we can select the guest OS family, say Windows, and the guest OS version. Call it Windows 10 if you will. Now, Windows 10 has some minimum system requirements, as do most operating systems that we might choose to use. And when we select that here, it doesn't mean that we'll actually have automagically that operating system installed. No, we still have to find an ISO image and mount that ISO image to a virtual CD device and boot to that virtual CD device and install the operating system. But what it does for us is it tells ESXi and vCenter that we're going to be installing a particular version of a particular operating system. And so please at least get us started with this wizard with some of the basic requirements for that operating system. For example, which SCSI controllers might be the most appropriate? Give me a minimum amount of virtual CPU, a minimum amount of virtual RAM, a minimum size for that hard disk. Okay? But we can continue by saying, you know what? I'm going to be installing some applications in this virtual machine that require more than just the minimum settings. So this gives us an opportunity then to choose the things that we know better we will require later on down the road. Now, in most cases, we can modify these settings later on. Sometimes we can modify these settings even while the virtual machine is powered on. That all depends on the capabilities of the operating system that we're about to install. Once we've gone through the wizard, we attach the ISO image, we power on the virtual machine, we boot to that ISO image, and we install the guest OS like anybody would normally install a guest OS on a physical machine. That's the basics of it, right? And we'll dive in and we'll do some of this stuff in the lab as well. Now, an OVF template, or an OVF stands for Open Virtualization Format. So imagine I've built a virtual machine, and I've done all the configuration I want to do. Maybe it's a Linux virtual machine, and I've installed a database and a web server, and I have configured this virtual machine really nicely, and I'd like to hand it to somebody else. I'd like to maybe publish this on the internet for other people to use in their environments, whether they be VMware environments or using somebody else's hypervisor or some other hypervisor. Well, they might choose to build a virtual appliance and then hand that off to you so that you can import that onto your ESXi host through vCenter Server. Okay? So virtual appliances are a really nice way to collaborate with others or to deliver your own software to your customers. Okay? You can go over to VMware's Solutions Exchange, do a quick Google search for that, and you will find a whole list of virtual appliances that you can try on your own and play with from VMware partners. Now, once your operating system is installed and you have access through a console, and we'll show you that in a second, the very next thing that you want to do is install VMware Tools. Now, VMware Tools will help us to make your operating system and your virtual machine the most efficient that it can be in our particular environment. VMware Tools includes some very specific device drivers that help us to work in a vSphere environment. Things like a high-res graphics driver, things like the VMXNet 3 network adapter that helps us to bypass much of the overhead that might be incurred while working in a hypervisor environment and hit the hardware directly. Things like the Balloon driver for memory management and the Sync driver for quiescing I/O when we do things like take snapshots. Now, all of this at this point, or much of this, might be foreign to you. You might have heard of things like the Balloon driver, but we'll dive deeper into each of those things a little bit later. Suffice it to say, this really helps with things like increased graphics performance when using the vSphere console, improved mouse performance when using the vSphere console. You might think, oh my gosh, mouse performance, who cares about mouse performance? Trust me when I say that when you are using a graphical interface in a vSphere console without VMware Tools, moving the mouse around is actually quite difficult. But as soon as VMware Tools gets installed, boom, you've got it ready to go, and it makes it really super easy to work within that environment and get it at the very least ready so that you can manage that system through tools like SSH or remote desktop services, other protocols beyond just a client, or a console, rather. It includes a heartbeat service, VMware Tools does, to let ESXi itself know that your virtual machine is nice and healthy and it's operating. It includes the ability to synchronize time with the host that it's running on. It includes the ability to shut down the virtual machine from the vSphere client itself. You know those little stop and play and pause buttons? Well, without VMware Tools, that little stop button is like pulling the plug on the virtual machine. It powers it off. But when we hit the stop button after VMware Tools is installed, we actually execute a graceful shutdown. The reason that we can do this is that VMware Tools provides a conduit from ESXi into the guest operating system so that we can send commands like, please shut down the guest OS. Please quiesce the I/O so that we can nicely take a snapshot. Things like that. VMware Tools comes with your standard ESXi installation, but you can actually also come to VMware's download site so that you can download specific versions of VMware Tools. Now, right off the bat, with ESXi, you get windows.iso and you get linux.iso. Okay? For Windows, it's anything greater than Windows Vista. There is a separate prevista.iso file that you can actually download from VMware that allows you to work with things like Windows 2000 and Windows XP and even earlier operating systems. You might choose to install VMware Tools in Linux operating systems from the ISO image, or you might choose to use OpenVMware Tools or OpenVM Tools that is available from your standard Linux software repositories. RPM, Yum, apt, those sorts of things. There's a VMware Tools for macOS and Solaris, also available from the VMware website. So here's an example of me coming to the VMware website where I can choose a particular version of VMware Tools, and I can download the ISO image, then mount it to the virtual machine in question, and then launch the installers from there. Now it's time to get into our labs. We've got a couple of labs coming up here. The first one, lab number 3, has us building a virtual machine, right? Now we're not going to do much with this virtual machine except use it as an exercise to go through the wizard. And in fact, in this virtual machine, we won't even take the time to install the guest OS itself. Once you've built the virtual machine and you see that it's there, we'll go ahead and delete that virtual machine. Because in lab number 4, we've actually got a virtual machine that's already pre-built for you. And the idea in this lab is that we're going to power it on, we're going to open a console to the VM, and we're going to install VMware Tools. Why don't we go ahead and finish off this lesson here before you jump into the lab, okay? At this point, we have a bit of an understanding as to how to go through that wizard and build new virtual machines. We didn't show you too deeply in the slides here because you're doing it for yourself in the lab environment. We know how to import an OVF template. We understand what an open virtualization format kind of looks like, and that we can import those virtual appliances ourselves. We understand the importance of VMware Tools, and we now have the ability to install VMware Tools and understand the importance of that as well. So when we come back, we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into all of the options that we have as we provision our virtual machines with virtual hardware. So go off and do the labs, and we'll see you back in a few minutes.